Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Surrey Board of Trade. I am Rona Doria, Events and Sponsorship Coordinator of Surrey Board of Trade. I want to welcome you to today's Digital Impact Learning Lab, Inclusive by Design, Strategies for a Resilient Workplace. I wanted to remind you that if you have any questions during this session, please put your questions or comments in the chat function and we will get to them as soon as we can. If you are unable to answer your questions, we will get back to you after the session is over. I acknowledge that we are in the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Kwikwetlam, Kakite, Semiahmoo, and Tuasin First Nations. As well, I acknowledge the Inuit and Métis Nations peoples who live and work on these territories. This workshop is co-hosted by the Surrey Board of Trade and South Surrey White Rock of Chamber of Commerce, soon to come together as the Surrey and White Rock Board of Trade. We are currently awaiting federal government approval, which we anticipate this spring. Together, we will be a stronger voice for local businesses. Check our diversified portfolios at businessinsurrey.com and SSWR chamberofcommerce.ca. Your facilitator today is Sean McEwen, a workplace equity, diversity, inclusion, and culture consultant with over 26 years of experience. As a director at Real Eyes Capacity Consultants, he supports businesses and nonprofit across Canada in creating a diverse, sustainable workplaces. Sean founded the GEDI Hub, Western Canada's first employer resource center for EDI, and has built regional, provincial, and national inclusion networks. An Alberta Premier's Council Award of Excellence in Employment recipient and certified employment specialist, he has a background in youth services and mental health. Diagnosed later in his career with multiple disabilities, he brings both professional expertise and personal perspective to his work, strengthening his commitment to fostering inclusive, equitable workplaces. Sean, over to you.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm usually based in Victoria and had to fly to Halifax. Got in last night about 2 o'clock in the morning, so I apologize if I'm a little puffy and sleepy looking, and hopefully I'll stay on point for this session. This is work that I'm very passionate about. I've been working with marginalized people, primarily people with disabilities, for my whole career. And when I started designing and facilitating employment inclusion services for people with disabilities, I realized just how important work is to us all and how it gives us purpose, it gives us economic capacity. It's really such an important thing in our lives. And I'm sure that you all know and feel this, given that you're business owners yourselves. So I want to talk about things that disability actually is and things that disability isn't. We make a lot of assumptions about disability, and so I want to kind of lead us through that to hopefully give people some more information to make better decisions about recruitment of people with disabilities. So we'll talk about some key disability awareness concepts, workplace accommodations, which are a lot simpler than most people give them credit for, as well as some inclusive onboarding techniques and strategies. When it comes to the recruitment of people with disabilities, there's a lot the general public, including employers, don't know. It's an important consideration. There's no shame in not knowing things, and in fact, if we take a growth mindset, the belief that we have the ability to learn new things and apply those new things, it will get us through the coming decade of declining workforce participation and having to access more diverse groups. So when I talk about these things, there's a lot of information here, and I'm going to talk relatively quickly about it, but keep in mind, you don't have to do every single one of these things. There are strategies that might pop as that would work here, and there might be other strategies that that you don't feel like you've got the ability to proceed with. I will make sure that my contact information is available. Like I said, I'm based out of Victoria, and I do consulting on disability awareness, disability inclusion, workplace accommodations, Indigenous equity, and workplace psychological health and safety. So if there are parts of this that you want to know more about, feel free to contact me. So some key awareness concepts. Let's start with just what we believe. And talk about something called bias. Although we value objective decisions in principle, our brains are pretty hardwired to lean on bias. Our brains are working all the time to keep the show running, to keep our bodies running, to deal with the environment around us. So our brains lean on bias pretty naturally. Again, no shame in that. In objective terms, it's a cognitive function that involves shortcuts designed to help keep us safe and make decisions easier. So we got a bias test, and it starts with, can you feel yourself breathing? And if the answer to that is yes, then you are alive and in fact have bias. Very common thing. When it comes to disability, when it comes to things that are unfamiliar to us, our natural bias, neuroscience tells us, is to consider things and people in categories of threats and reward. And any group of people that are unfamiliar to us, our brain will fairly quickly lean towards a threat bias. So we need to consider that as we're making decisions about who we want to recruit and what's best for our companies, because there's a lot of good reasons that for diversity. There's a lot of important reasons we'll talk about. But as we're doing that, keep in mind, your brain does tend to lean towards bias. When we're talking about disability, it's a big word, right? Disability covers an awful lot of things. It covers medical issues, cognitive issues. We need to think about the fact that there's a lot of diversity in disability. So if we look at this information from a 2021 survey of Canadian HR professionals on what their perceived barriers were to the recruitment and retention of people with disabilities, these were some of the things that came up for them. The physical environment, location and safety. They thought high psychological or physical demands might be a worry, stigma and bias. There might be budget, cost, and resource needs because of accommodations, and a perceived lack of skills and competencies. Those are those are perceptions that a group of very well educated people had about another group of people that they hadn't even met yet. And I would like to point out that if a group of HR professionals made these assumptions about any other diversity group on the planet, they might be dealing with some problems in terms of keeping their employment. We cannot assume that every disability is going to involve these kinds of barriers. And in fact, it won't. If we look at just the number of people, the representation of people with disabilities in our society, it's kind of overwhelming when you look at it. This is not a minority group anymore. 27% of working age Canadians identify as having a disability. There's lots more that don't identify as being a person with a disability. Disability is something that's new to me, and I'll talk about it in a second. 50% of us experience a mental health issue by the age of 40, and 40% of the global population lives with a neurological condition. The odds of becoming disabled by the time we retire are 1 in 3. And that's something that very strange for me to spend my entire career helping people with disabilities get into the workforce. And then in my 50s, get diagnosed with hearing loss, with chronic pain due to a nerve damage in my neck, probably too much downhill mountain biking. The hearing loss is probably from singing in a punk rock band through my 20s. That didn't help me at all. Um, Many issues come up on us as we age, and the World Health Organization acknowledges that disability is kind of a universal condition, that every human being can experience a decline in health and functioning as they age. So just some information to keep in mind. And what this means also is that if you're currently employing 50 people, you may actually have 10 people working for you that have disabilities. So it's important to keep in mind how you talk about disability and how you address disability in your workplace so that we're not alienating people that are already there. So let's explore what we think and know about disability. Intellectual and developmental neurodiversity disabilities. These are some general categories of disability from a fairly medical context. So these first disabilities, you might be thinking of people with Down syndrome, um, people with some types of autism. The thing about intellectual and developmental disabilities is that 90% of them are what's called idiopathic, meaning there's no known cause. So if there's no name for these different types of disabilities. There's hundreds and hundreds of different types of intellectual disabilities and how they manifest. You can see people that probably can't work because of the degree of their disability, and you see other people that may have unusual communication skills but remember every single fact they've ever learned. So there are talents hidden even in this group, really interesting talents hidden in there. Learning disabilities, all types of learning disabilities. I'm sure all of us went to school with kids that have learning disabilities or have our own different types of learning disabilities, dyslexia, things like that. Mental health disabilities, there's more than 200 types of mental health disabilities. Dexterity disabilities, so the kinds of things caused by nerve damage, dexterity impairment in arms, hands, and fingers. Sensory disabilities, hearing or vision loss. Mobility impairments, and this is, generally when people think of disability, they either think of someone with Down syndrome or someone in a wheelchair, and there's about 1,000 other things in between all of those. Speech and language impairment as well can be a different type of disability, and medical or pain-related disability. This is one of the most common disabilities that we see in our society, and one that is pretty easy to accommodate most of the time. We can have visible disabilities, so types of disability that we can see, it's obvious, but over 90% of disabilities are invisible. We would not be able to see them. You can't necessarily, unless someone is having a psychotic break, you can't necessarily see a mental health disability, for instance. Medical disabilities, learning disabilities, we can't see those things. Disability can be permanent, it can be episodic, something that kind of comes and goes. If you think of different mental health disabilities or something like Crohn's colitis or celiac disease, disabilities can be temporary. That's another thing to consider is, do you ski or snowboard or mountain bike? You will eventually have a temporary disability. I can attest to that. And also undiagnosed disability. I have met people in their 50s who lost a job, got some testing to try and figure out what they should do, and discovered that they had an intellectual disability, and they'd been working very successfully for 30 years of their lives, but couldn't get into a new job because of that disability. So important to keep in mind. Disability, there was a disabilities and inclusion study in the US that revealed that a full 30% of the US professional workforce has a disability, but most keep it secret. Only 39% had disclosed that disability to their manager. So again, important to consider, you're probably already employing some people with disabilities. My point in covering all of this information is we're making a lot of assumptions about what people can and can't do without ever having met them, because the word disability is just so big and all-encompassing, and our brains do tend to go to a place of bias. When we hear the word disability, what are the images that pop into our mind? Is it a person who can't speak, who's in a wheelchair? Is it a person with Down syndrome who we know probably isn't going to have the educational capacity to do the work that we're looking for? We're wrong every time we do that. There are so many different things. I know people with disabilities who can bench press my weight until they get bored. I know people with disabilities that can do data entry and highly complex organizational development work and work harder than anyone else in the agency. It's so many different things. So we have to actually meet the person. Most of us will experience disability in our lives. There's countless ways that disability can affect or not affect a person. And we do tend to just assign qualities or an absence of qualities to disability without really considering the person. So realistically, it's our attitudes and our bias about disability that create the biggest barriers for 27% of our working age population in Canada. And what I would really like to point out is we're missing out on talent if we do that. This idea of thinking that people with disabilities can't do the job without ever having met them, it is a type of discrimination, and this bias, prejudice, and discrimination against people with disabilities is called ableism, and believing people with disabilities are less than, not addressing accessibility issues, physical or systemic, ableist language. You know, we still throw around words like retard, crazy. The word that really strikes me all the time is the word invalid, which is really just the word invalid with an accent in a different place in the word. So we do have this discrimination against disability that's very deeply embedded in our culture, in our society. We decided a long time ago that people with disabilities should be put in workhouses, they should be separated from the rest of the public because they couldn't participate economically. And there's been a lot that's happened over the last couple hundred years in terms of shutting people with disabilities away. And that kind of behavior, what's called cultural persistence, it stays with us. Even though we get new information, we think we're progressing, we do tend to hang on to old ideas in our culture on a systemic level. So let's redefine disability. Let's look at what it actually is. A universal human experience that almost all of us will experience by the time we move on to the next plane. A condition of the social model of disability. The social model of disability says that it's not necessarily within the person, their disability, it's actually a result of the person having a condition or an impairment and then encountering a non-inclusive society or physical barriers in that society. That's what disability is. Something that I know from, excuse me, something I know from 25 years of supervising teams of people that are getting people with disabilities into the workforce is that disability absolutely is diversity. People with disabilities have problem solving skills and new perspectives that we need in the workforce. That's the whole point of diversity, right? It's not about just having representation. It's about getting in new thoughts, new ideas, new perspectives, and new problem solving capacities. And most of the folks with disabilities that we've served over the years have been solving problems that the rest of us haven't even had to think about for their whole lives. So please consider that disability is really a type of diversity. I also would like to talk quickly about intersectionality. So when a person with a disability is also Black or Indigenous or a person of color, you start to see increases in barriers. So the ways that elements of our identity, such as gender, race, and ability, overlap and intersect with one another, that's what intersectionality it is. There was a study that KPMG did in December that revealed 41% of working people with disabilities had experienced ableism at work within the last 12 months. But if the person with a disability was also Indigenous or Black, that number went up by 50%. So all of a sudden, it was 60-some% of people that had experienced ableism. So we need to kind of keep in mind that each marginalizing identity can create new barriers and discrimination, and that denying that reality is psychologically harmful to people. So if you're working with folks with disabilities, especially if there's other identities involved, acknowledging those barriers and exploring each person's experience is a best practice. When we think about disability and trying to assess employability, what's really important is, does this person want to work? Literally in 25 years of doing this work with folks with disabilities and sitting in intake meetings with most of them, that's the only question that matters. Does this person want to work? If they say, no, my mom wants me to work, or no, my financial benefits person wants me to work, I don't think that that's a terribly employable person at that time. But if a person wants to work and we just figure out what are they really good at and what, if any, type of support or accommodations do they need, it's pretty easy to get people into the workforce and functioning just as well as any other employee in your workplace. We worry about accommodation costs a lot, and I just want to point out that fewer than a third of people with disabilities even require accommodations, and are budgetary issue. I think most of the time is not a relevant worry. For the folks that are going to need, specialized software, things like that, that's a minority of people, and they tend to know exactly what that software is. They've used it before, and there are government assistance programs to help pay for those kinds of things. I've also encountered people who needed special, not software, but headsets for communication in a workplace. And when the employer saw how effective it was, he just bought that kind of headset for every single person in the call center and used it because it was more effective. It worked better. So sometimes what you think is going to be a burden, this accommodation, ends up making your workplace better. So a good disability inclusion strategy starts with leadership commitment. You're not going to move anything forward without a leadership commitment. Creating a clear, inclusive workplace statement, including disability. So talking about your community, your commitment to community. You recognize that your community is increasingly diverse. You want to see that level of representation and community representation in your workplace. Diversity is important to your organization, those kinds of statements. And you can find those things on the Hire for Talent website if you want to look at something and edit it, make it your own. There are excellent resources there. Creating workplace accommodation policies and procedures is a best practice, and we will talk about that momentarily. Including equity, diversity, and inclusion awareness and skills in supervisor job descriptions and performance evaluations. If you want to make sure that something gets done, measure it, right? You've heard that before. What gets measured is what gets done. Maybe that twisted that around. So if you're expecting a person, if you're expecting a manager or supervisor to be good at managing diversity, including disability, I'll say it again, disability is diversity. If you're expecting that, have it in their job description, have it in the performance evaluation. This is going to be a really important thing over the next 10 years as we lose about 25% of our current workforce to people aging out. Replacement workforce is going to be younger generations, immigrants, and people currently underrepresented in our workforce, such as folks with disabilities and Indigenous people. So let's talk about workplace accommodations. This is something that is a really critical equity skill. And let's talk about equity first. What does that mean? Equity starts with the recognition that we don't always see the barriers that we don't personally face, but that those barriers are very real for the people that do experience them. So considering an employee's unique circumstance and making workplace adjustments so that the end result is equal. That is what equity is about. It's making sure that everyone is getting a fair shake at at participating in our workplace and receiving the same benefits in that workplace. It can also be about identifying and removing intentional or unintentional barriers. When we see, for instance, that some people are really struggling to deal with online applications and applicant tracking systems, placing a workaround right on the website where your job is posted. Placing a workaround that says, if you're struggling to apply for this job, call us at blah, blah, blah. That's an example of equity. Ensuring that a person's identity, ultimately, this is what equity is, ensuring that a person's identity isn't what determines workplace opportunities or outcomes. So workplace accommodations, this is again a critical area of employment equity. Most employers and HR professionals report a lack of confidence and understanding around workplace accommodation. And workplace accommodation, most important thing I'm going to say here, it's not just for people with disabilities. There are 13 different protected grounds against discrimination that are listed in the Canadian Human Rights Act and the provincial human rights acts that follow that. And all of those can be reasonable grounds for workplace accommodations. So learning how to do workplace accommodations as our workplace gets more diverse really is a critical equity skill for employers. It will help you to attract and retain talent. It's a legal obligation as well, to be clear. Every employer has a duty to provide reasonable accommodation to the point of undue hardship. And as I've said, most workplace accommodations are low cost or no cost, and you're probably already accommodating employees in different ways. The thing that scares some employers about workplace accommodations is their experiences with a return to work model after an employee gets injured, where you've got a couple of lawyers, some doctors, an insurance company involved. It's a very high maintenance. It's a little bit intense. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about somebody who says, can I change this part of my job description a little bit so that I can do the job effectively? So when we talk about undue hardship, we're talking about financial implications and costs. If someone needs to have a wheelchair ramp installed at the business, that's not a big deal. That's probably a couple $100 at most. If they need an elevator installed in your building, that's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's not going to be something you can do. Disruption of operations, if the person's accommodation would make it too hard for anyone else to do the job there, creating morale problems or substantial interference with the rights of others. That could be undue hardship. And I'll give you an example here. So and this will kind of demonstrate that workplace accommodations, what is reasonable accommodation in one workplace might be undue hardship in another. So for instance, if you have 100 employees and a person asks, hey, can I have a workplace accommodation where I work fewer hours per week? You're asking for 40 hours. I can do 30, but more than 30, and my stamina, might have a medical disability, my stamina just won't tolerate that, and I won't be able to work as well. If you have 100 employees, that's probably easy to do because you have enough personnel that extra 10 hours might be covered pretty easily. If you have 3 employees, you probably can't do that. That would create morale problems and substantial interference with the rights of others. Interchangeability of workforce and facilities. Some jobs you can allow people to work remotely or on a hybrid basis, but if you're an emergency room nurse, you're not working remotely. If you're a paramedic, a first responder of any kind, nobody's working remotely in that situation. So that would be undue hardship. If the accommodation request causes health or safety concerns, you also, within an accommodation, do not need to tolerate absenteeism or ongoing performance issues. Those are separate matters. And you don't need to create new or unnecessary employment. So these are These are important things to consider, and every workplace is going to have different measurement for undue hardship. So keep in mind, Canadian courts have been very clear that undue hardship is unique to every situation. The size and nature of your business is going to have a big influence on that. I'm hoping this makes sense for people. If there's any part of this you want to know more about, we can talk about that and put a question in the chat. There are also excellent online resources that you can find at the end of this presentation. The real return on investment for getting good at workplace accommodations and putting a framework in place to allow them to happen, it enables people to provide their full range of talents and skills. It helps create workplace equity and increases engagement, performance, job satisfaction, retention, and it demonstrates that you're an inclusive employer, which will help you attract talent in the very near future of work. We absolutely are going to be facing a labor supply shortage, labor supply issue. It's the single biggest demographic issue on the planet right now. I think 60% of humans are living in countries with stagnant or shrinking workforces. And the countries that are not are countries like Nigeria. Nigeria had more babies last year than all of Europe combined. So if we think about what that means, it means the future of work here is going to be more diverse than it currently is. So workplace accommodations can apply to how the work is done. So it can apply to the individual, the environment, tools, tasks, schedules, or it might apply to some work-life balance issues. It might apply to childcare, health management, the person's culture or religion. People have different barriers, needs, and life circumstances, and they don't all fit into the same neat little boxes across their lifespan. This is why and how accommodation helps all employees participate as equally as possible. And important to note, accommodation can apply as early as the job application process, interviews, testing and training that you're doing with people. It can start very early. So common sense approach. First of all, don't wing it. Get a framework in place. Have an inclusive workplace statement. State that anyone who requires workplace accommodation can ask for that your organization complies with the Human Rights Commission of Canada, and you will provide reasonable accommodation to the point of undue hardship. Here are the processes and protocols for accessing a workplace accommodation. When you're communicating that stuff right off the bat, it's really hard for anyone to complain about it. And we can source those kinds of workplace accommodation policy templates from workplace equity organizations like the Job Accommodation Network, the Canadian Human Rights Commission. There's probably some information about this on the Hire for Talent website. So keep an open mind to understand that even though we might be seeing barriers that don't affect us personally, it's really important for us as employers to design an inclusive workplace that allows people to contribute their full range of talents. So acquiring and developing that framework, the policy processes and forms, is your first step. Maintaining a good faith approach, believing that the need is real. Often people wonder, well, what if this, I can't see what this barrier is. What if it's not real? Well, if if for 95% of your employees, it is real, it's worth doing for the 5% that are trying to game the system. And I promise you, you will see the people that are trying to game the system. You will see that eventually it will become apparent, especially if you follow this plan and evaluate the accommodation frequently. So working together with that person to explore what is the workplace limitation or inequity that they're experiencing in the workplace, creating user-friendly processes, not deterrents. One of the worst things you can do is offer workplace accommodations and then make it too hard for the person to actually access them. that is not good for your brand. Ensure that the accommodation really matches the person's needs as well as your resources. You do not have to create an undue hardship situation for yourself. And then review and evaluate those accommodations and the processes on a relatively frequent basis so that you're sure this is working for people. Because I promise you'll be doing more of them as the years go by and our workplaces get more diverse. We will be doing more different types of workplace accommodation. May as well get good at it now. A final really important consideration around accommodation, confidentiality, privacy, and respect. Disclosing a diagnosis is not the employee's obligation. They're only required to disclose information needed for you to appropriately respond to the request, such as the limitation and how that limitation is impacting their participation in the workplace. It is not the employer's right to know what the person's diagnosis is, and where medical or disability related accommodations are concerned, it's not the employee's obligation to disclose those diagnoses. So consider the level of detail that you really need, focus on the limitations and needs, and please use caution with documentation requests. If you start asking for medical documentation or psychological documentation, then you have to comply with privacy legislation and have very clear policies on how you're collecting that information, where you're keeping it, the storage, who has access to it. There's a lot that goes into that. And so again, I would just encourage a good faith approach in accommodation design. And it's, I guess, the other thing to consider, just respecting personal dignity and right to privacy. There are types of disabilities. Let's consider PTSD. Do you really want to know the whole story about why this person has PTSD and how it relates to a workplace accommodation? You may find that information rather traumatizing to hear yourself, and you may re-traumatize the person by making them, by forcing a disclosure, forcing provision of information around that. So please consider the person's privacy and dignity. So designing with confidence, recognizing that an accommodation need exists and facilitating a discussion, collaboratively exploring with the person. Think about accommodation as a conversation, a solution-focused conversation that you're having with an employee. Establish their needs, make an informed decision based on that information and their needs. They very often have had that accommodation before, know exactly what it is. Document and implement the accommodation. That's something that a lot of disability organizations don't push enough. We need to make sure that we're documenting accommodations when they're about disability, so that if you win the lottery and stop going to work, your replacement manager doesn't look at this person and say, why are they doing everything differently? They're fired, and get rid of them. I've actually seen that happen before, where a new manager doesn't understand the accommodation because no one bothered to document it. So document the accommodation and implement it. Have some type of communication policy that shows respect for approved accommodation. I've heard from employers that some employees might approach them and say, why is Jonathan getting this special treatment here? I think this is unfair. Having a communication policy around accommodation, and having a framework for that accommodation allows you to say to that employee who is complaining about someone else having an accommodation, you know from reading our policy manual that we provide workplace accommodations to the point of undue hardship. And the day that you need an accommodation, you'll get one. And I won't be giving other people the details of your accommodation. That's private. So all you really need to know is this is an approved accommodation that is between this employee and ourselves. you're not going to need for things to be that laid out for a lot of accommodations. Some of them are going to be real obvious, you know, Jody's leaving early to pick up her kid from childcare because they close um, before we finish work. Those kinds of things. Some of it will be really obvious, but where it's medical disability, psychological disability, things like that, nobody else has the right to know about that. Okay, let's talk about some inclusive onboarding techniques and strategies. Folks, I'd like to encourage you to research a little bit of human-centered design. This is about designing things, environments, and systems in ways that work for everyone. And it's really just a way of thinking about something. It's an inclusive mindset that we can all use to increase access and inclusion by simply asking before we design something, who would be excluded by this? Who would be excluded by this environment, this new office space that we want to rent in this part of town? Who would be excluded by using this app to track these elements of our work? Who would be excluded by us using applicant tracking systems to decide who are the best candidates as we're advertising? Who would be excluded within the wording of this email? Who would be excluded by us purchasing these choices of office furniture? We're designing things all the time. Every time we write an email, every time we alter office space, buy desks, choose software, we're designing things or making design choices. So stopping, press pause, asking, are there people that would really be excluded if we went this way? And is there anything we could do differently to make that more inclusive and accommodating before we then have to accommodate on an individual level later? And to be clear, those are processes that will work for 100% of your employees. An example, years ago, I stopped buying desks that weren't the adjustable desks because I realized occasionally we're going to hire people that use wheelchairs. We're going to hire people that develop sciatica and need to stand and work. There are so many reasons why people will need flexibility in their workstations, work environments. Why not just do that proactively? Job postings. Let's include an inclusive workplace statement in a job posting that's really attractive to most people, particularly younger generations. People they want to work for inclusive employers. Indicate the availability of interview accommodations. Let people know we're going to do a 3-person panel interview on the 2nd floor of a walk-up building, and we're going to get you to do a 30-minute Microsoft Excel test afterwards. Is there any type of accommodation you would require for that? Different application processes for disability-related barriers. Again, putting on your electronic job posting, if you have a disability or language-based barrier to responding to this job posting, please call us at. Sending postings to service provider partners, that's something that you can do to source talent from diverse areas. So whether that's a disability service provider, we'll talk a bit about them, or some other type of diversity employment service provider, having those kinds of partnerships allows you to source talent better. So in offering an interview, as we describe the interview location, access, style, etc. Describe your policy and offer accommodations. And if you do offer accommodation, follow through on that. If somebody says, I have an anxiety disorder, could I have the questions in advance? Give them the questions in advance. I promise you, it's not going to create an unlevel playing field. I've done this multiple times. It doesn't result in any higher level of hiring for the people I've given the questions to. We also need to look at expanding recruitment networks, seeking new diverse talent pools, and utilizing service providers can help that. Asking questions that explore Diverse life experiences, that's something that we should really consider adding to our interview process. If we're trying to enlist diversity to bring in new problem-solving skills and new perspectives, let's explore that with people in interviews. Let's ask everyone in interviews, tell me about a big challenge you've overcome in your life. Tell me about a problem that you solved that you're proud of the way you solved it. Those kinds of things. We can use alternative methods to verify candidate suitability. If a person with a disability has different needs in terms of interviewing, we can do video interviews. We can work with service providers to figure out um, where essentially a job site tour, a walking interview, where the person gets a tour of the work site. They maybe even try out some tasks and see if it's right for them. It's not like recruitment, the traditional style of recruitment has worked so well for us that we should never try anything different. So finally, let's look at workplace inclusion partnership plans. So this is about service providers. The majority of employers who cite successful recruitment and retention of workers with disabilities are using service providers. And there are lots of them in British Columbia, lots of disability employment service providers that you can find them on the Hire for Talent website. You can also find them through provincial organizations like Aspect, for instance. So finding service providers near you is the start. Booking a meeting, ideally at your business, so they can see what you do, what are the range of positions that you have in that work environment, sharing knowledge with them about your personnel needs, your personnel issues, staff turnover, different roles, what's your workplace culture like? Those would be important things to share with them. And exploring the range and type of services they offer and establish a potential partnership match. It's a conversation that will let you know if that's something you would like to proceed with. If you're struggling to find a service provider, just do a Google search of your municipality plus disability plus employment services, and you'll see a list. Yeah. So service providers are typically provincially or federally funded, generally nonprofit organizations. They're contracted by government to provide employment services to people underrepresented in the labor market, but they're also contracted to meet employer needs and to work effectively with employers to meet personnel needs. Think of them as like free uh, pre-placement services and HR consulting. These service providers that help people with disabilities get into the workforce, in my experience, know more about workplace inclusion than most entities in Canada. So they'll provide services to you and the job seeker. These services will vary from province to province, and as well as their contract type. Some services only serve people who are deaf or people with mental health issues or people with intellectual disabilities. So it's ask questions, find out who you're talking to and what the range of services they provide might be. And for alternatives, there are other types of diversity employment services. So Indigenous employment services, immigrant employment services. The folks that are helping them tend to have good resources for employers. So some key areas to prioritize for us, remembering that bias, discrimination, and ableism, the ways that our brains quickly seek to try and succeed, whether or not those are valid ways of succeeding, those things can create barriers for folks with disabilities. Disability is absolutely as diverse as humanity, and disability is not inability. That should be on everybody's t-shirt. Disability is not inability. The programs I have overseen have helped well over 1,000 people with disabilities get into the workforce, and their success and retention rates were higher than the employers had experienced with non-disabled people. So please realize that a person with a disability isn't a person who's unable to work. Workplace accommodations will absolutely improve staff performance and retention, not only for the people you give the accommodation to, but for others. Inclusive design will increase inclusion, accessibility, and retention. Using training plans, mentors, and regular feedback will increase retention. There's good resources on the Hire for Talent website for that. And expanding your recruitment networks to disability and diversity services will help you meet your personnel needs better and succeed in the future of work. Prioritize the tactics I've talked about that really work for you. You don't have to try and do every single one of these things. Thank you very much. That's the conclusion of the presentation. And here are the references that you can access through the folks at Surrey Board of Trade. And do we have some time for questions?
We have a couple minutes for questions. We didn't have too many come in, but if anybody has some questions while I ask this next one, please feel free to put it in the chat and I'll make sure Sean gets to it. I kind of wanted to, because I get to see this presentation often, but I'd love to hear just an example of where you've seen an accommodation put into place and kind of what the long-term effects that had on an employee. So kind of like the point A to point Z. For an accommodation that you saw actually help improve somebody's quality of work and life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I talked about the accommodation where the woman had asked for the headset, the different headset, and the employer realized, oh, this just works more effectively for everyone, and applied that to within their workplace. I've watched the same thing happen at, what is the restaurant? Olive Garden restaurant in Calgary, where a person suddenly had to recognize and remember 10 or 11 different shapes of pasta as they started working in the kitchen, and they couldn't. So the employer ended up using an iPad as part of their training process so that people could easily see what are these different types of pasta. So it was an accommodation that worked well for that person, and they didn't need it forever. You know, they eventually learned all of the different types of pasta, but it became a really effective training tool for everyone that they hired there. So those are the kinds of accommodations we see that work really well. There was another guy that worked at a dry cleaner, and they had different colored tags based on the fabrics, but he was colorblind. So they just added big numbers to the tags, which again, in the low light of that environment, made it easier for people to see. So that was a really effective accommodation as well.
Correct. Somebody asked if we could share the references. There will be a slide deck shared post presentation today, just to let everybody know. Okay. So I would say you probably have about 2 minutes, Sean. Is there anything else that's you might have not been able to touch on that you might want to kind of just address or talk about a little bit further? Because I know it is something that we kind of had to bring together and just give you an extra little second to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. There keep being new messages show up all the time here too. I guess one of the most important things to consider, really, we're looking at a future of work where we've got an aging population and some serious labor supply issues that are coming. Those things are going to we're already starting to see them, but they're going to get worse as time goes by. And I think it's so critical for employers to realize hiring people with disabilities is a really effective way to get comfortable with all different types of equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's really solid research to show that hiring folks with disabilities and working with a service provider to do so builds equity, diversity, and inclusion capacity to the point that employers improve their ability to hire and retain people from all diversity groups. And if you want to know, I was in the Toronto airport last night. You want to get an idea of how diverse our society is becoming. Go to an airport. Go to an airport and look at who are the people that work at the airport, who are the people that are walking through the airport. this country is getting more diverse by the month. We've got a working population that's getting younger and more diverse. They care about inclusion. They care about inclusive workplace cultures. These are things we need to start getting good at now, and we can rely on service providers and people with disabilities that they represent to help us do that, to help us prepare for the future of work.
Perfect. I think that is a great launching off point. So I'm gonna go ahead and thank everybody before we head out today. I want to first thank Sean. Obviously, we love to hear what you have to say every single time I watch this. I do pick up something new. We also want to thank the hosts today, the Surrey Board of Trade, and especially the people on the back end, Rona and Heather, for taking the time in order to help make this a possibility today. And yeah, with that said, I will encourage anybody to go ahead and do the form that was sent in the survey that was sent in the chat in order to make sure that we can get those honorariums paid up quickly. So without further ado, I'm going to send it back to the Surrey Board of Trade to close this out today. But thank you everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you, Sean and Dylan, for being with us today and sharing this important information. We will be sending you the recording and the facilitator's contact information after this session. Many more of this type of these sessions are coming up, so please be sure to check our website at businessinsurrey.com. Make it a great business morning, everyone. Thank you.